My name is Victor Fuhrman. Some call me the Voice. I've always been fascinated with human nature, spirituality, science, and the crossroads at which they meet. Join me now and we will explore these topics and so much more with fascinating guests, authors, and experts who will guide us to Destination Unlimited. In 1997, Irish author John O'Donoghue published his book, Anam Cara, a Book of Celtic Wisdom. The words Anam Cara are from a Celtic expression meaning soul friend in religion and spirituality. It implies the compassionate and healing presence that two people may offer one another on a deep and profound level. My guest this week on Destination Unlimited, New York Times #1 best-selling author of Care of the Soul, Thomas Moore, has shared this idea in his work and teaching. He has written 24 other books about bringing soul to personal life and culture, deepening spirituality, humanizing medicine, finding meaningful work, imagining sexuality with soul, and doing religion in a fresh way. In his youth, he was a monk and studied music composition. He has a doctorate in religious studies from Syracuse University and has been practicing depth psychotherapy for 35 years. He lectures and gives workshops in several countries on depth spirituality, soulful medicine, and psychotherapy, influenced mainly by Carl Jung and James Hillman. In his work, Thomas often brings together spirituality, mythology, deep psychology, and the arts, emphasizing the importance of images and imagination. He often travels and lectures, hoping to create a more soulful society. Thomas regularly appears on television and radio, including Oprah Winfrey's Super Soul Sunday and On Being. He lives in New England with his wife, the artist Joan Hanley. His website is thomasmooresoul.com, and he joins me this week to share his latest book, Soul Therapy, The Art and Craft of Caring Conversations. It is my pleasure to welcome to Destination Unlimited, Thomas Moore. Thomas, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for asking me, Victor.
Thomas, you've graced our world with more than 30 books, including your 1992 classic, Care of the Soul. Many of them have titles that include soul, including your just published Soul Therapy. Please share with our listeners the journey of your soul and how it manifested in your path.
Oh, that's a big story. When I was a young man, I left home and became a Catholic monk and did that for 13 years. And that has had a big effect on me. I think that's probably the root of my interest in soul today. And then I eventually studied depth psychology, the psychology of Carl Jung and James Hillman. And they both write about soul. The word psychology and psychotherapy, the psyche part means soul. It doesn't mean mind in history. It doesn't mean behavior or anything like that. It means soul. So it's natural that thoughtful people thinking about the psyche would use the word soul. And that's it's a mysterious word, and it has some religious overtones. They don't bother me. I'm not religious in a conventional sense, but I certainly am interested in the sacred side of things. But primarily, the soul of my work is about our depth, what gives our lives meaning and values and identity. I think those are the three things that soul bestows.
Before we discuss soul therapy, I'd like to briefly talk about your 2014 book, A Religion of One's Own. I received the unlikely call to interfaith ministry in my mid-40s through a series of synchronicities. What inspired you to write A Religion of One's Own, and where do you see the balance between those leading a secular life and those following a faith today?
As I say, I really devoted myself to a faith system, to Catholicism, uh, for a good part of my life when I was young. So I know what that's like, but I began to question, and I think in some ways I was educated out of that particular way of doing things. And I began to wander around and eventually got a degree, a PhD in religious studies, where I put together a study of the world's religions and spiritual traditions on one side and depth psychology on the other. I think they connect very closely. So, Religion of One's Own is a book I wanted to write for people who feel, as I did, that the religious institution is no longer right for them. That it, with its certainties and its authorities and sometimes rigid traditions, that a lot of people like me felt they wanted a more open environment. They didn't want to lose their sense of the sacred and their devotedness to a spiritual life, but they didn't want to do it in that same way. And so I wanted to write this book, A Religion of One's Own, to say that you can go your own way and thoughtfully put together a life that really will make sense to you and will adequately replace any kind of religious institution that you've been involved with.
And what about people today who may not feel connected to their birth faith, but are looking for something else?
Well, I think there are many options. Here in the United States, we have a wonderful tradition of people like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau and Emily Dickinson and others who wrote beautiful books. And of course, Dickinson, incredible poetry. And they all wrote about the soul, and every one of them left behind a religious institution they were involved with. Emerson was ordained, an ordained minister, and he gave that up. And instead, what they did was turn to the natural world as part of their spirituality, you might say, and their ethics, working for the against racism in their time, and generally working out a way of seeing their lives and life in general in a spiritual way. So I think we have that as a resource. We have the natural world. We have other things that don't maybe seem sacred to people, but really are, like the role of parenting, raising children, being married, doing work that contributes to humanity. All of these things can be part of a religion of your own, even if they're not part of the institutions.
Your new book, Soul Therapy, comes at a time when our world is facing unprecedented challenges and anxiety. Let's start with your inspiration for this book.
The immediate inspiration for it was 18 years of teaching therapists of all kinds who would come to Cape Cod in the summers for their continuing education credits. And I would teach a course that was different from most that they were getting. Most of the courses they were getting were either medical or quantitative studies, that kind of thing. So I tried to teach them what the spiritual traditions had to offer, as well as depth psychology. As I said, I always like to put those two together. So I did that for these therapists for 18 years. That was quite an experience. Sometimes there were well over 200 people in these classes. And so they were all coming from different places. So I learned a lot about where therapists are. And I thought recently that I no longer teach there, that it would really be a good idea to put those thoughts together and write a book for therapists. That was my first thought. And then I thought, well, I also would like to write to the ordinary person. I always do. And I thought, what I could do is write how all of us, or each of us at different times, are therapists in a smaller, more ordinary sense, where we talk to our family members and friends sometimes when they are in need. And a lot of times people tell me that they feel unqualified to do that. So I thought it would be good to write a book that would help the ordinary person feel more secure and confident about speaking at a deep level with their, as I say, with their friends or co-workers, family members, in serious and with serious conversation.
How do you define soul therapy, and how does this differ from what most would understand as traditional psychotherapy?
Well, traditional psychotherapy often is very effective. It may involve some medications. That's a common thing. It may involve advice giving or trying to help a person manage their lives and make their relationships work better, try to work out their vocation, what they should do in their life, all that kind of thing. It's kind of a management of life largely. Soul therapy is really much deeper. It's about especially about the impact of past experiences on your present life, not just childhood, but throughout life, and about efforts that you have had maybe to look for meaning in life, and a lot to do with bad influences. So many people have been hurt in the course of their lives through school, teachers, through parents, through an uncle or grandfather, grandmother. So many people that I see as a therapist are carrying these wounds from their previous life, and going into that in a way that tries to explore these narratives as stories that have a lasting effect. Joined with the fact that in my therapy, I always use dream work. I work with people's dreams all the time as trying to see the underlying patterns that are going on in a person's struggles. So all of that makes it more of a soul therapy than a life therapy.
And we're going to touch upon some of those things as the interview goes along. In the book, you share the Irish expression Anam Cara. Does that reflect what we're talking about?
I think it does. I heard that word first in Ireland. I have spent a good part of my life in Ireland, and I've heard this phrase from ordinary people. They will say, well, that's the Anam Cara. What they mean is a kind of solid, deep friendship that is dedicated to the welfare of one or the other people in the friendship, in the relationship. So it's not just having a friend. It's actually a kind of friendship where one person consciously tries to guide the other person through tough times.
And is this based upon some type of special experience?
I wouldn't say that there's a special experience because it is really a friendship. It does have this special quality of maybe going through a tough time with somebody, but not just accompanying them, but actually trying to offer some help, some guidance as they go through it. One person takes the role of guide. It may shift because we all go through difficult times, and so that relationship may shift a bit. But I think the concept of Anam Cara is a deep one. It means soul friend. And it means that you're not just friends, but you're actually caring for each other's souls, to use my language.
You offer a wonderful parable in your book of a dog and an elephant and their friendship as an example of mutual soul therapy. Please share that with our listeners.
Yes, it's a simple story about a dog and an elephant who became friends. Animals do befriend each other. They do get close. And they become very dependent on each other sometimes. And in the story, the dog is quite an attractive dog, and someone comes along and wants to buy the dog. So he buys the dog and takes it away from the elephant, and the elephant gets sick and despondent, and it looks depressed. And the elephant trainers are very concerned. So they go and get the dog back. And when the dog returns, the elephant, of course, recovers his health and his happiness. Well, it's a very simple story about how even among animals, it's not about any particular thing you do that is therapeutic. It's not like you figure yourself out or you solve a problem in life. It's that you recover a friendship, and that itself can be therapeutic.
So, in essence, that shared presence is what's doing the therapy.
Yes, exactly. So that's why I think many therapists, no matter what their background, understand that being with somebody who comes to you for some guidance is the foundation of the work. It's about being present to the other person and not just treating them as a case to be figured out and solved. It's being present. And I say in this book, and I know it's a bit controversial among therapists, I say that there's a certain kind of therapeutic friendship that is not the same as just having a friend. Therapists usually don't want to become friends as such with their clients because they want the professional relationship, and they don't just want to be ordinary friends. But I think there's a kind of friendship that is not so literal. It's more like the spirit or tone of friendship that can be there in a therapeutic relationship and do what happened with the dog and the elephant. That the presence and even the slightest sense of friend can be useful.
Now, you touched upon this briefly. What are the life experiences that wound the soul?
Well, it's, I think, just of the people that I have worked with, that's one way to start. I would have to say that the worst, one of the most common and worst life experiences that can really wound a person's soul is parents not being able to be good parents. A lot of parents don't realize that they have an important role or position to play in the child's life. They react to the child too spontaneously and unconsciously. They don't remember that they're parents and not just ordinary people. And as a result, they act out their own frustrations and their own immaturities with their children. And when people come to me as adults, I mean, they can be in their 50s and 60s, and they're still trying to resolve these issues that began with their parents. So that's one of the first things. Teachers also have an impact on children, and sometimes playmates. I've worked with people whose playmates have really, really hurt a person through bullying, even through sexual abuse. So it can be pretty bad. And there are a lot of things out there that wound a person's soul.
And what about things like you had mentioned teachers and parents and school? When someone is told, for example, that they lack skills in mathematics or in verbal skills, what effect does that have in the long term?
It depends how they're told. I was told at one point in my life in college that I was one of the worst people in math they ever encountered. That really didn't bother me, because I knew that, and I was able to live with that. I knew that when I started. I think it's okay. It's just sometimes you just need to be told what's up, what's going on. On the other hand, with a child especially, if you say something to them that you may think is just a fact, like you're not too good at something, whatever it is, the child will naturally take it as, I'm not good. And that's a very tough thing for a child to get along with. They hear that early in their lives and they carry it around with them. Believe me, I hear this so often. Way later, when a person's in their 40s, 50s, 60s, they're still carrying this message that I'm not good. And it's got to be sorted out. You can do that therapeutically by going over those stories. And what I do is try to help a person really sort out that story, to tell a lot of details so that we really understand what happened there and what was going on. And that breaking up of the story into its parts helps loosen a person from it so they don't have to carry it around with them all the time.
In my experience with the communities, the spiritual and helping communities that I've been associated with, one of the common recurring aspects is that people are so willing to extend themselves to others, often at the expense of taking care of themselves. What would you say to them?
Well, I pointed out if I saw it, I do see that in many people. You see both things. You see that, and then you see people are they give too much of themselves. Now, what I do in my work, I learned this from some of my teachers, is we say we go into the symptom instead of against it. What that means is that if someone tends to give too much of themselves, what I will do is see if there's some way in which they are not giving enough, that the symptom points out what needs to be done. So it sounds counterintuitive, but that's how I think it works. So what I do is I don't want to get caught in this automatic thing, I have to help this person take care of themselves more and think about themselves more. I don't think that's a good way to do it, because what is going on there might be a hidden kind of taking care of themselves. A lot of times these things are hidden and concealed. So what I do is go with the symptom. And I describe this in the book. I describe the case of a man who gave away his money too loosely. He couldn't go down the street without giving money to people on the street. And you would think right away that he has to learn how to take care of himself. But actually, as we talked it over very thoroughly with him, we discovered that he really hated giving that money away. And he wasn't giving it away freely. He felt compelled. He had a compulsion to do it. And we tracked that to some teachings he got when he was quite young. And we discovered that he had to learn how to really be generous in other ways instead of just doing it compulsively on the street.
My guest is Thomas Moore. He's the author of the new book, Soul Therapy, The Art and Craft of Caring Conversations. Thomas, please tell our listeners where they can get your book and find out more about your work.
Well, you can get all my books, including this new one, Soul Therapy. You can get it anywhere. You can buy it online to any of the usual sources. You can get it at your local independent bookstore, which is what I do. You can even get it signed if you want by going to an independent bookstore of mine. You'd have to get in touch with me. And I have a website, thomasmooresoul.com, thomasmooresoul.com. And there's information there about a course in soul psychology that I teach online, and which is going extremely well. So all those sources are pretty easy.
And we'll be back with more of Thomas after these words on the OMTimes Radio Network.
Free your mind with OMTimes Radio, IOM FM. OMTimes Magazine is one of the leading online content providers of positivity, wellness, and personal empowerment. A philanthropic organization, their net proceeds are funneled to support worldwide charity initiatives via Humanity Healing International. Through their commitment to creating community and providing conscious content, they aspire to uplift humanity on a global scale. OMTimes, co-creating a more conscious lifestyle.
Back on Destination Unlimited, my guest this week, Thomas Moore. We're talking about his new book, Soul Therapy, The Art and Craft of Caring Conversations. Thomas, what is the difference between soul therapy and life management?
Well, the life management tends to focus on what's going on in the externals of life. I mean, they usually include emotions, but it has to do often with relationships, with work, with, to how to make your life get moving. A lot of people are looking for purpose and looking for work that really makes sense to them, that they can love, so they're not fighting it all the time. A great number of people come into therapy because of marriage difficulties or other relationship issues, because in a way, this is really where I think most people have to face the difficulty of emotions. So that is a big part of, in the sense, management, in the sense that usually it's about, getting people to talk to each other and communicate with each other better, and maybe to get to know each other better. The soul therapy has a different focus. I as a practitioner of this myself, I'm interested in knowing what this person feels destined to do in life. Like, what would really make you feel that your life has meaning and that it has been fulfilled, give you a sense of fulfillment. And what is your nature? Who are you anyway? And what are these mysterious aspects of your existence? Like, what is the timeline of your life? Tell the story, the narrative of your life. When you tell that story, do you see any deeper themes that keep coming up? And what people have been very influential in your life, and how do they live in you today? How do they continue to affect you today, for good and for bad? So the soul work, the soul therapy, is a little more mysterious and not quite so literal and practical.
You say that ordinary people can have deep conversations that are truly therapeutic. What advice would you share with them?
Well, I think a very simple thought, first of all, is when you're having any conversation with somebody, and it's somebody that is a good friend or an important relationship, and you don't want to just be on the surface all the time, you can take it on yourself to deepen the relation, deeper the conversation, deepen it. For example, I usually say you can take it down a notch, just take it down one step. So you're talking to someone, you're talking about the weather, or you're talking about what you're going to be doing next week. And you can deepen any of that. You can say, oh yeah, the weather, does it ever get you down? Or does it affect you very much? That itself is taking the conversation to a deeper level. And if you do that 3 or 4 times in a conversation, you've got yourself down where you're talking about things that are meaningful to both people. And that kind of conversation then can lead, maybe the next time you'll go even deeper. And eventually you'll have the kind of conversations that I'm calling soul therapy.
And are there ways that average person can become more skillful in talking to friends and relatives about really important emotional matters?
Oh, yes, there are some very important skills and things to watch out for. One skill is to be able to, we talk about good listening, to be able to listen. It's not just hearing what people are saying, but hearing what they're not saying, noticing maybe what they're avoiding. You can sense that when people are talking. You might say to them, well, it sounds to me you're trying to say something even more important somehow, but you're not really getting it out. And something like that. Or you might notice an underlying story, like someone's telling you that they're depressed, and you might say, well, is this a kind of a black depression, or is it sort of a gray depression? What kind of depression are you talking about? There are different ways that you can talk that keep the conversation going and going deeper. And you also have to notice, this is an important thing that I discuss under a chapter called Transference. Transference is a word used by some psychologists to generally refer to the transfer of dynamics in a relationship from earlier in your life to the present. Very often transference is discussed in the way you might bring some earlier patterns of relating to your relationship with your therapist. But I think transference goes on between people all the time. So it means that, let's say you're talking to somebody and you suddenly realize that you're treating them as if they were one of your children. In other words, you're transferring your attitude toward your children to this person that is suddenly in front of you. And that awareness can be very useful. It helps you know that you are not being exactly clear, that there's some static in your conversation that you could clear up. And it also, if you're really good at it, you get to know what the other person, what's going on with that person too. If you notice that you react to them in a certain way, that reaction of yours might tell you something about what they are and what they're doing. So it gets very subtle. And I didn't want to get too detailed in this chapter on transference, but I do think it helps for the ordinary person to think about some of these things. I imagined it as an ordinary person listening in on a conversation with a professional therapist and picking up some pointers, not to become a professional, but just get some lessons on how you might be able to do your ordinary conversations better.
There are occasions when friends offer advice in these situations that really are not helpful and may reinforce the foundational issue. Are there ways an average person may become more skillful in listening and responding to friends and relatives about these?
Generally, it's not such a good idea to give advice. What you're doing when you think about it, you're looking at your own experience and kind of putting it on the other person. You're assuming that they're like you and that what has been useful to you is going to be useful to them. That may be the case sometimes, but I would say usually not. The important thing is to let the other person talk about their own experience and maybe even discover their own solutions. That's much better than giving advice. Advice giving is really not therapy. It's tempting because I think the average person probably thinks when someone wants to talk to you, they want your advice, but that's only, that's just sort of a common sense kind of approach. You need to think more deeply about this. That's why I think it's helpful to get some good ideas about how to talk to people. And when you learn more about it, one thing you can learn is that by feeding back some of the things that people are telling you, like letting them know that you've heard them clearly. Like if someone says to you, I've been doubting myself lately, and I never did that before. I've always been very confident, but lately I've been doubting myself. And you could say, if the emotion is strong, especially, you could say, well, yeah, you're doubting yourself these days, and that's something new for you, isn't it? It's like you're not adding anything of your own, but you are feeding back to them what they are saying so that they can hear it, maybe hear it differently, hear it from somebody else. And this is a method that was taught by Carl Rogers. I was trained in that method in my early training. I find it very useful at times, especially in very emotional times, and it's easy to teach, although I did 2 years of training in that, and it took a while, really, with supervision to really get it. But I think it's something that can be taught to people to use as one of their methods to not give the other person your own opinions, but rather to really let them hear what they've been telling you. That is a good foundation for a therapeutic conversation.
Are there other shadow issues that may come up with friends talking caringly to each other?
Yes, there are a lot of things. For example, the friend who's been asked to help out might think, well, so in this case, this poor guy, I'm healthy and I've got my life together and he's really a mess. You might feel kind of superior. That would be a shadow figure. What we, a darker feeling you have that doesn't help the situation and is rather negative. So that may be something you feel. The therapist, the professional therapist, has to worry about quite a bit of shadow things like, about thinking about money or the time, or might have some negative thoughts about their client, something like that. I think the average person trying to be a therapeutic friend, they have to watch out for that superiority. They also have to watch out for the shadow that they know more than they really do. They may approach their friend thinking, well, I'm pretty smart. I know how these things work. A lot of people feel that way. They feel, well, I've been around, I know, and I think I have something I can tell this guy, this person, this friend of mine. That's kind of a shadow quality too, because it's like you're thinking that you're smarter than you really are. That's a shadow. And that's something that comes up in this kind of conversation.
Are there any darker or shadow issues that are appropriate to embrace?
Well, they're all appropriate in a sense. I mean, in the sense that we are all human beings, and we are naturally going to have some what do you call them, blind spots in talking to people. We may not know what we're doing sometimes. We may be saying the wrong thing. So in that sense, the thing about shadow is, the basic theory of shadow is that you don't try to get rid of it necessarily. If it's really interfering and if it's really bad, you're really acting it out, you have to do something. But normal shadow qualities that just pop up in a relationship like that are to be expected. And you don't have to get rid of them. It's good to know them. Being aware of them really helps a lot. But you can't be perfect. And so you can't be worrying all the time that I've got all these problems when I have my own blind spots when I'm working with people. If you know that you've got them, you're okay. And then you're okay. If you don't know you have those things, then yeah, you could act them out sometimes, and that may be a problem. But you don't have to get rid of them. You just have to acknowledge them and deal with them the best you can.
You had talked earlier about therapists working with dreams that their clients have. Are dreams insightful and appropriate to share in friend-to-friend conversations?
It's a little tricky because dreams are not that easy to work with. Someone tells you a dream, and most of the time it's going to seem very confusing and difficult to get a hold of. You can become skilled at dream work over time. Both a professional and an ordinary person can. I do think, and I've come to trust the ordinary person's ability, if they have a little guidance especially, to work with a dream and just try to lightly take the images and see what they might suggest without trying to interpret or figure out the dream. I always say that you should not interpret the dream, but talk about it and see if your imagination and your sense of metaphor might help you see how the dream might be connected to this person's life and personality. So I think it's worth a try. I really do, with people, especially if you discover you might have some natural skill at dream work. Some people are just hopeless, that they don't think that way. They think more with an engineer's mind than with a poet's mind. You really have to have a sense of poetry when you work with a dream. But the dreams are so useful that I think it's worth a try for anyone to say, well, do you dream these days at all? And what I find useful there would be to have a conversation with the dreamer rather than to try to be smart and interpret the dream. Have a conversation with the dreamer about the dream and say, well, what does this image here make you think of? And then you say, well, what it makes me think of is a little different. And you go that way instead of trying to conquer the dream.
Would it help parents if they felt they could speak therapeutically to their children? And if so, how may they go about it?
Certainly would help children if parents could realize that there's a way of talking that is therapeutic, not in a professional way, but in an ordinary way that would be useful and helpful to the child. Seems to me having been a parent, I've raised 2 kids, and my sense is that at least half the time, I don't know, maybe that's saying it too much, but probably around half the time you have to speak as a parent. And that means most of the time speaking therapeutically. So if the child is feeling upset, the child is crying or expressing anger or rage or sad, any of these strong emotions, that's really the time for the parent to speak therapeutically and not just give advice or tell the child what to do. That's the time for the parent to draw out a story. That's what I say in this book, that getting the narrative is really the key. Getting a story about the emotion. This is what Carl Jung taught, and I think it's right. You need a story, an image for the emotion. And that's not too hard to do. You just coax the child to talk a little more. What happened and what happened then, and how did you feel about that? And how are you feeling now about it? And this anger, what do you feel like you want to do? And get all those things out into images, and then they have less of a tendency to act out the emotion.
My guest is Thomas Moore. His new book, Soul Therapy, The Art and Craft of Caring Conversations. We'll be back with more after these words on the OMTimes Radio Network.
Humanity Healing International is a small nonprofit with a big dream. Since 2007, HHI has been working tirelessly to bring help to communities with little or no hope. Our projects are not broad mandates, nor are they overnight solutions, but they bring the reassurance that no one is alone and that someone cares. To learn more, please visit humanityhealing.org. Humanity Healing is where your heart is.
We've all felt left out. And for people who move to this country, that feeling lasts more than a moment. We can change that. Learn how at belongingbeginswithus.org. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Back on Destination Unlimited, my guest's Thomas Moore. His new book, Soul Therapy, The Art and Craft of Caring Conversations. How may children offer soul therapy to elderly and infirm parents, especially those who are close to transition?
That's a good question, but it's not an easy one. I think, first of all, and this is true of everything that we've been talking about, either a professional therapist or an ordinary therapist has to have faced his or her own life issues himself or herself. They really have to do that. That's why professional therapists often are required to go through therapy themselves, not to learn from that experience so much as to know themselves better, so that they aren't going to be acting out their own stuff, their own anxieties and fears with their clients. Now, when it comes to talking about to your parents, and they're reaching an age and they are perhaps on the edge of death, you have to know for yourself, first of all, are you comfortable in talking about this? And I say this from having spent a lot of time over the past 20 to 30 years in hospitals, talking to nurses and doctors in hospitals. And one of the things I found out early on was that these doctors and nurses, whom you might expect to be familiar with death and dying, are anxious about it. They haven't worked it out for themselves. That's not true of everybody, but I did find it often enough to see that it's a problem. So if you're dealing with your parents' death or their extreme old age, I think you have to have faced that for yourself. Your own aging, for example. If you have aged carefully and thoughtfully, without fear, and with joy in life, you have a much better chance of talking to your parents in ways that will help them than if you are always afraid of aging. And that's a big issue. It takes a lot for a person, no matter what time in life, to face a big change. Lately, the book I published just before this was about aging, Ageless Soul. And I found in talking about that book, I discussed it with many people turning 30 who were very anxious about getting old. And I realized when I had those conversations that aging is not just about literally getting old. It's about going through these turning points, these important zeros in our life, and having a philosophy of life where you can age and age with happiness and not have a lot of fears about it. So I would say that helping your parents starts with yourself. Starts with asking the tough questions, thinking about it, and then maybe talking it over with somebody else who might be able to join you. Talking it over, like, what do you feel about your parents dying, or that looks like they may not live too much longer? How do you feel? How do you feel about that? Can you think about this in a way maybe that will actually bring positive experience to your parents? If you're not capable of it, then do some work on it. Talk about it with somebody, because that's going to come through. And you've got to deal with it.
You talk about creating a vessel for deep, caring conversation. How do we do that in the real world?
There are different ways of making a vessel. I get that word from alchemy, which is something that Jung talked about a great deal. Alchemy was a practice in which people put a lot of materials like chemicals and just ordinary stuff from around the house in a glass vessel and heated it up, put some liquid in it, and looked at the images and tried to make something. They tried to make medicines and even gold. But the main idea was to look at these images and gain insight. And to do that, you needed this glass vessel. And so Jung uses this metaphor of the vessel for therapy. So when we do therapy with someone, even informally, we create a vessel. Now, you can start by the actual literal space where you meet, because that's part of the vessel. That holds you, it contains you. Should you meet at a restaurant? Should you meet for lunch? Should you meet in a very quiet place in nature? You've got to figure that out for yourself. Where would you and your other person, your friend, where would they be comfortable? Where would you be comfortable? Can you secure a place that would be private enough so that the person will feel free enough to be able to talk freely? That's an important part of that physical vessel. When you decide to go somewhere, let's say to come to your house, can you find a room that is comfortable with chairs that are comfortable and maybe surroundings that are supportive and make you feel good instead of something very severe and cold? All of those are questions about the physical vessel. Then there is the vessel of your own person. So part of creating the vessel is ensuring your friend that you can keep things private, that whatever he tells you, you can keep to yourself and make those assurances. That's part of creating that kind of a vessel. It's not a visible one, but it's one that's between you, and it's an important one. And you can also create the vessel by explaining what's going on. You might say, well, I'm not a professional, but I think I'm pretty good at listening, and I'd be happy to talk to you privately. I can't give you advice really, but I could listen to what you're saying and maybe help you sort it all out. That's creating a vessel to say something like that.
Are therapeutic conversations appropriate in the workplace?
Oh, yes, they're appropriate and necessary in the workplace. I have talked to a number of business managers and owners who are very concerned about their employees. And they talk to them, like if they notice absenteeism, they talk to them and say, what's going on? You know, they have a private conversation, a personal one, and say, what's going on? I'd hate to see you jeopardize your job here because of something that's happening. If there's anything I can do to help, let me know. If you need some professional advice, let me know. I could maybe find somebody for you. If you need some time off, that's something you might want to consider. Things like that. That's all therapeutic talk. You don't have to analyze somebody to be therapeutic. You can talk to them in a way that's useful, that has a certain element of friendliness to it, and offering support.
There's a line in the book of Ecclesiastes that says, there is nothing new under the sun. How may our life stories be a reflection of classic myths and long-shared family stories?
This is something very close to my heart, how ancient stories crop up in the stories of our own lives. I mentioned before Hamlet. That's out of Shakespeare. That's not ancient, but it's old enough that sometimes you might think that if you look at your sadness, you might read Hamlet and say, wow, that really helps me understand or get some insight into what I'm going through. Or you might want to, you might see a movie that has a theme that really strikes close to home to what experiences you might be having. In our professional work, we often, in my work anyway, I refer to mythology. In my work, mainly Greek mythology. And I see that many of the old stories are being lived today. They're being lived today in our own way, and maybe just pieces of those stories. For example, one that a lot of people understand and sometimes refer to is the story of Icarus, a young boy who wanted to fly high and overhear the secrets of the gods. And he had his uncle make wax wings for him, but the wings melted when he got too close to the sun, and down he went crashing. A lot of people today know that that story is being lived by people who are too ambitious. They're flying too high, and their wings melt, and they come down in a crash. It's dangerous sometimes to be too ambitious, to reach too high. There's an example of how a story being told by a friend might be clarified by referring it to, by comparing it to one of the ancient stories. So for that purpose, I often teach therapists about mythology and fairy tales. Just today, I gave a class on fairy tales as a source of these stories that crop up in people's lives.
What would you like your readers to take away from soul therapy?
I would like them to realize that life as a problem is difficult for all of us, and we need each other. We need each other to be able to listen to what we're going through. Sometimes you just can't stand it. You need to tell somebody what's happening. That just getting it off your chest is therapeutic. It's even better if you have someone who really listens well, listens closely to what you're saying. It is not trying to give you advice before you even finish speaking. So I think that what I'd like people to understand is that we can be, all of us, be therapists. I always put in quotation marks. I don't mean the professional at all. I mean therapist in the broader sense, that you can have a caring relationship with somebody that's useful and helpful. And we can all do that for each other. And it's very satisfying to be able to do it for somebody else. And of course, it's satisfying to another person who's going through something like grief, like you mentioned, to be able to listen. I remember once in my own family, my grandmother, who was in her 80s at the time, she lost her husband, my grandfather. And she was crying, sitting in the couch with the family around crying. And she said something like, "Oh, I know I shouldn't be crying." And somebody immediately said, "Oh, no, Grandma, it's okay to cry. You know, that this is a sad time. And we are happy to be with you here if you need to cry." Well, that was a therapeutic statement from a family member. It's maybe obvious and simple, but it's still therapeutic. I would hope that this book would give people the support and encouragement and confidence to be that kind of person in their families, for their children, at work, and for their friends and neighbors.
His wonderful new book is called Soul Therapy. Thomas Moore, please, one more time, please share with our listeners where they can get your book and find out more about your work.
I would recommend getting my books at your local independent bookstore. They're so good. You know, these independent stores, they do this work for love primarily, and they help you, they guide you, and they can order any book you need and get it quickly. Another way is, of course, any of the various sources online where you can get the book fast. My website is Thomas More Soul. That's like one word, Thomas More Soul, 2 O's and more. thomasmoresoul.com.
Thomas, my gratitude to you on behalf of our listeners for this book and for everything you have gifted our world with. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Victor. I appreciate the way you conduct this interview. Very, very good. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us on Destination Unlimited. I'm Victor, the Voice Fuhrman. Have a wonderful week.